those of you joining us online, we welcome you to our last in-person seminar for the year. And we thank you for being part of it throughout the course of the year. So before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we have met today and pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. So for today, we are very privileged to have our co-director of InfUr speaking to us about an important project that really connects to many of the things that we do. And for those of us who do not know Crystal, she is the superstar of Informal Urbanism Hub, and she has done extensive research on community engagement and has also been very prolific in terms of international conferences and presenting as a keynote speaker. So we are very privileged to have her today speak to us about an important project that really is on her heart. So I would encourage everyone to pay attention, and also if you have any comments or questions, just keep them. And I hope she'll be able to deliver 45-minute lecture. Then after that, we'll have about 20 minutes of discussion. So without much ado, please let's welcome Crystal.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of Wurundjeri people and the Kulin Nation. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The talk I'm delivering today is an amended version of the Pat Troy Memorial Lecture I did last year at the State of Australasian Cities Conference, SOAC. And that lecture was published in UPR, Urban Policy and Research. So you can read the full paper there if you're interested. I think I'm going to stand up for this. It's a bit dramatic to stand up, but I'm going to try to add some dramatic flair to the best of my ability. Okay. I'm going to make sure this is working. There we go. It's late November 2014. The Victorian state election was held on Saturday, and the Labour Party government, led by Daniel Andrews, would form government. A decisive victory, and some commentators would call it a historic victory. Indeed, preventing the coalition from enjoying a second term in government is historic. But so is the cancellation of the East-West Link project after it was hailed as a fait accompli after the signing of the project's contracts. A few weeks later, after this Labour victory, the Andrews government would release the business case of the controversial East-West Link, and accusations made and published in The Age would be directed at the previous government for misrepresenting the full costs of the East-West Link, with figures now showing that the project did not stack up economically. In the lead up to that 2014 state election, I was inspired by urban planning students from across Victorian planning schools, who joined together to articulate an alternative transport vision for the state. I was also moved by the way local governments in the inner north challenged the state on their decision to prioritize road-based transport projects. I was also energized by the community groups and everyday citizens deeply concerned about the building of the East-West Link, and who were showing up every day at the comprehensive impact statement panel, as well as those who took to the streets to demonstrate their concerns. As a young transport planning academic at the time, who was also researching community engagement, this was a moment when I shifted my focus from looking at formal practices of community participation, so those sanctioned by government, to the informal ways in which communities can generate power. I was inspired by what I was witnessing. Was this a different kind of participatory planning? That Monday after the election was a joyous one for those deeply concerned about the building of the East-West Link and the trajectory of ongoing car-based dependency that project had come to represent. That moment also provided an important reminder that communities, when they come together, have the capacity to influence political systems and win in the face of power, in the face of government and corporate power. The Labour victory was followed by the establishment of Infrastructure Victoria and the use of a citizens' jury to support the development of its inaugural 10-year infrastructure strategy. In 2015, there were early signs that meaningful engagement with communities on the prioritization of future projects would represent the start of a new era where community engagement would be central to the establishment of infrastructure priorities. Again, as a young scholar of transport planning and community engagement at the time, my little hopeful heart was full with joy. The city that had come to love, that had migrated to, was showing up for its citizens in new ways. Could this be the start of something good? A new way forward for infrastructure planning? Alas, the joy would be short-lived. A few weeks later, after the formal cancellation of the East-West Link, the newly elected Labour Party government announced the Westgate Tunnel project, a market-led proposed project by Transurban, who would later gain planning approval to build the project in partnership with the state government. And there would be more. Soon, the announcement of the Northeast Link project, then Melbourne Metro, and then eventually, in the lead up to the 2018 state election, the suburban rail loop, heralding in an era of mega project building at a scale not seen in decades in Victoria. But interestingly, community engagement in infrastructure planning would become happy companions. We would see the introduction of community liaison committees and community reference groups to support the late planning and then delivery of these major projects. And conferences like the National Community Engagement and Infrastructure Forum would become important sites for knowledge exchange and the sharing of best practices for public engagement professionals working across Australia on the delivery of these mega projects. As I sat there observing the increasing opportunities for community engagement, I was seeing on one hand an acceleration of participation within infrastructure planning, but on the other, the announcement of projects like the market-led Westgate Tunnel and eventually the suburban rail loop with no clear links back to strategic transport planning, the very documents where communities tend to enjoy the most influence within the life cycle of infrastructure planning and delivery. Perhaps what I was seeing was not the empowered community engagement that we are often promised, where communities have the opportunity to question state-based priorities. What I was observing was something else. Some scholars have called it building a social license, while others have described it as meaningful engagement where clear expectations are set as to the limits of community influence. At that time, I couldn't quite put language to the discomfort I was feeling. Community engagement is good, and infrastructure delivery is important. And to question the grounds upon which one's engagement in infrastructure planning are set and by whom is to be met with the response, what are you talking about? This is best practice. This is the most extensive community engagement program we've ever delivered in the state. Communities have never had more opportunities than this. So what is your problem? What are you worried about? Faced with these responses, one may start to question if their feelings of discomfort are real or simply manufactured in one's mind. It's been 10 years since the rise of a newfound relationship between community engagement and infrastructure planning in Victoria. And in that time, I've been left pondering the question, if participation is good for planning, and it can be good for infrastructure delivery, is participatory planning always good for communities? I would eventually find the words to describe my discomfort as I continued my research into community engagement and the structure of its politics. I use this opening vignette as my point of entry into thinking about structural gaslighting and the role it plays in urban planning. And it's here that I need to recognize my positionality within this work. I'm a white settler, cisgendered, able-bodied, solo living, child-free, middle-class woman with a continuing position at a university. I have privilege and a platform. While on one hand, I have limited authority to speak on the issues of gaslighting, on the other hand, I have lived experience as someone who's been gaslit within her interpersonal life throughout her private life. Given this context, I limit my engagement to insights that can be drawn for urban planning practitioners, researchers, and teachers like myself, who are navigating and thinking about how we might do participation differently as participation becomes increasingly at risk of becoming a commodity, a means to an end, increasingly commercialized because of the privatization of its practice. The examples I share are drawn from insights from research conducted with many colleagues over 10 years on the politics of transport infrastructure planning and the politics of participation in Melbourne. So infrastructural gaslighting with Chris Gibson and Dallas Rogers, infrastructure governance with Turin Elzadad, Rebecca Clemens, Glenn Searle, Linton Camerazman, and the professionalization of participation with Janice Berry, Morgan Boyko, and Matt Novichesky. As a result of this work, I've been invited into many community-led spaces, and I continue to be inspired by the place-based work of people living and working in these communities as activists and advocates participating in urban planning from the edges. I'm deeply grateful for those opportunities. So my central contention in the paper is participation in planning has a politics, and that politics has a structure. Precisely, it is the embracing of participatory practices that showcases a commitment to quality, inclusivity, and just-based planning, thereby strengthening planning's connection to the wider democratic project. It is also the same just-based practices that can be used to manipulate the community's relationship with the state in ways that protect the interests of the most powerful elite actors. In the context of infrastructure planning, where elite networks of actors consolidate under hybrid governance arrangements, the power possessed by those occupying privileged access to the planning system are at risk of going unchallenged as new formal participatory spaces continue to develop within the boundaries set by these structures. There's growing recognition that processes supporting infrastructure planning are being depoliticized through the increasing and well-documented case of post-politics, as it's showing up in cities like Melbourne and Sydney. And these cities are suffering from a post-political condition that seeks to protect the power of the state and its elite networks by dampening any possibility of political challenge from within and outside the formal urban planning system. The paradox that this post-political condition supports reflects what philosopher Nora Bernstein calls structural gaslighting. In urban planning, we might see it as a paradoxical relationship between a government's commitment towards more just planning processes. And this includes community participation, which gets expressed in policies and rhetoric, and the increasing socio-spatial injustices that maintain the otherwise established socio-political order of winners and losers in infrastructure delivery. Scholars and advocates seeking to expand participatory planning see the potential it brings to infrastructure planning by supporting more inclusive cities and planning processes. Ostensibly, these sites also embody a promise. By participating, you will contribute to the shaping of planning cultures and institutions in ways that reflect your values. These are ideas that are grounded in the work of the late Patsy Healy, and it's a promise that has come to define the work of a generation of participatory planning scholars who are theorizing that by enlarging the possibility of different kinds of community-based knowledge to inform planning, participatory planning can release us from the constraints of top-down, expert-led, technocratic decision-making. This ideal, in turn, makes cities more inclusive, just, and democratic. But herein lies the paradox. On one hand, participation is core to the creation of climate-just and democratic cities. On the other hand, participation can also see the production of social licenses for infrastructure proponents seeking outcomes that are otherwise agnostic to the delivery of just, fair, and inclusive places. Here we must gesture to the work of critical urban planning literature and scholars by Margot Huxley, Orrin Yeftekel, Libby Porter, who lament that the stifling ways in which formal forms of participation perpetuate exclusions within planning systems. For Hans Ossenbaum, in his book, The Politics of Becoming, Anonymity and Democracy in the Digital Age, participatory forms of democracy possess the power to, and I'm quoting now, produce particular subjects that in many ways are seen as a product and an object of creation, rather than as autonomous self-explorers, end quote. It is important to make the distinction here. Ossenbaum is not refuting a claim made by Patsy Healy, where she described the virtue of participation as the possibility of, and I'm quoting, making sense together while living differently, through which a democratic form of planning can be realized. End quote. We are interconnected, and our encounters with each other are vital to the building of mutual understanding, and this includes in the processes involved in supporting the delivery of urban infrastructure. Rather, Ossenbaum's caution is speaking to the capacities of participatory publics to show up in these participatory spaces of planning as autonomous political subjects who can act politically in ways that result in challenges towards proposed infrastructure. In other words, the infrastructure planning system demands a certain kind of participating person, who is someone who supports project delivery. To create a participating public that adheres to the terms of engagement as set by the planning system, their capacities for their own political transformations as persons capable of acting politically and able to seed the conditions of new politics for new pathways forward, clear boundaries need to be set, and those boundaries also need to be respected by those participating publics. A lot of words with P's in them. To dampen some possibilities, participatory spaces are designed to reduce the scope for publics to engage authentically and on the terms they themselves are setting. And because of this, their capacities to challenge the conditions of their future participation become reduced. The paradox of participation described here exists within an ever-evolving landscape of infrastructure regulation and approval. And that paradox is itself evolving through the myriad ways that infrastructure planning and public engagement interplay. To understand these dynamics and how they impact communities, we need to become attuned to structural gaslighting as a condition of contemporary infrastructure planning. So people are typically familiar with the term gaslighting from contemporary social media and popular culture. It has its origins in the 1944 movie Gaslight, and that movie is a psychological thriller that portrays a husband who uses the gaslight in their furnace to manipulate his wife's own perception of reality. In doing so, the woman begins to believe that her sense of reality cannot be trusted, and she begins to second-guess her own instincts, resulting in her losing a sense of her own autonomy. At its core, and as described by Page Sweet, gaslighting is a kind of mind manipulation that draws on strategies and tactics that can be used to undermine the other person's sense of reality, thereby limiting their capacities to challenge authority. Broadening gaslighting and using it as an interpretive and analytical device to understand power structure, research into gaslighting is increasingly exploring how whole communities are gaslit through epistemic injustice. Recent literature on racial gaslighting by Davis and Ernst and Ruse and Sabrine unearthed insights about gaslighting that are revealing how it is commonly used as strategies long associated with the reproduction of democratic societies of systemic domination in forms of colonial, racial, gender, and class-based relationships, to name but a few. Structural gaslighting, as Nora Bernstein describes it, conceals and further normalizes the connection between oppression and what gives oppressors their license to continue. In Bernstein's words, structural gaslighting is, and I'm quoting, any conceptual work that functions to obscure the non-accidental connections between structures of oppression and the patterns of harm they produce and license. Individuals engage in structural gaslighting when they invoke epistemologies and ideologies of domination that actively disappear and obscure the actual causes and mechanisms and effects of oppression, end quote. When applied in planning, structural gaslighting casts attention onto how the conceptual work that participatory practices bring to infrastructure planning, its rhetorical promises of inclusion and deliberation, can also help to conceal the composition of planning's power by setting boundaries around the epistemologies of participation, thereby limiting what counts, what kinds of knowledges get to count, and by extension, what forms of participation are permitted. Importantly, the conceptual power of participation can be controlled by those in positions of privilege within existing urban planning systems, such as those elite networks, who become the ones who boundary setting. The relationship between gaslighting and the way power is structured through participatory planning is further revealed through the reading of Kate Abrahams' recent book on gaslighting, who claims that the central desire of the gaslighter is to limit challenges, which is achieved by destroying even the possibility of disagreement. So it's not about pushing back on disagreement, it's the possibility of disagreement and maintaining those limits over time. Reducing any possibility of conflict is to eliminate the source of possible disagreement, and in doing so, limit the potential for any independent or deliberative perspective to emerge from which disagreement might arise. Power comes from both the privileged position of elite actors and their increased capacity to set boundaries that help to maintain one way of knowing. It is important to note at this point that structural gaslighting as a concept is being debated within the political, philosophical literatures in terms of whether or not it is a true form of gaslighting. We can come back to that in discussion if that's of interest. But to progress this argument today, I'm going to keep going with structural gaslighting. And is that it's used to maintain privileged position. So gaslighting can be the source. Gaslighting can secure the gaslighter's position of authority, and in doing so, perpetuate an epistemic injustice, where those with power determine what is known, while the gaslit are reduced in their standing. But gaslighting does not just stop there. It will also work to diminish the credibility of the gaslit to offer challenges or generate contributions into the future. Specifically by understanding the capacity for structural gaslighting to protect and maintain existing power relationships will help to advance the long-standing critiques of participatory planning by showing how public engagement can be used by the powerful to gaslight communities. Participatory planning is both virtue and vice. That's my central contention. And for urban planning to be able to harness its potential to serve communities, we must also expose the capacity of the gaslighters to use participation by leveraging its virtuous qualities to manipulate communities in ways that both suppress dissent and further reduces the capacities of those being gaslit from challenging power into the future. To instill doubt in one's capacity to influence change is to shape their future participation. As Kate Mann aptly describes, participating publics become, and I'm quoting, much more reluctant than they otherwise would to be challenging the prevailing narratives, end quote. To reduce such challenges is to be able to control how those narratives are interpreted and critically assessed. To illustrate how structural gaslighting is shaping participation, we need to talk about the changing political economy of participatory planning and how it is limiting interpretive breadth and reinforcing dominant socio-political relationships, perpetuating who is winning and who is losing in the planning system. And here I return back to Victoria, where I've been doing some recent research on the changing landscape of participation and its professionalization. Oh, online. So recently, the state of Victoria revised its Local Government Act to include a commitment to deliberative forms of participation, a potentially progressive act by the Labor state government to enshrine in legislation a commitment towards a style of participation that supports the giving of public testimony. Very good. On one hand, deliberative participation supports dialogue from which mutual understanding, common ground, and even a consensus decision is made possible. This, after all, is a core virtue of participation. On the other hand, deliberative participation sets parameters around what a good deliberative citizen is, someone who is informed and can therefore engage productively within the invited spaces as set by the planning system. Referencing Faranak Mirataf when I'm talking about invited spaces. But what happens when the terms of that invitation are narrowed by those setting the parameters of participation? Taking signals again from Hans Eisenbaum, we might say that there's an evaluative tone in how participation is described in the Victorian legislation, and indeed in documents like the Public Engagement Framework. To outline quality engagement in this way presents a risk for participating people, which for Eisenbaum is when, and I'm quoting again from his work, democratic spaces for deliberation are constructed with the purpose of producing better, that is, empathetic, more publicly spirited, more knowledgeable citizens. Thus, democratic subjects are not free to change, but instead are subject to particular transformations designed by others. End quote. We can see this evaluative tone when we examine the changing political economy of participatory planning in a state like Victoria, where the enshrining of deliberative practice in Victorian legislation has not been an overnight occurrence. To understand this changing landscape, I turn to the rise and reach of an organization called the International Association for Public Participation, IAP2, in Australasia, which has been the focus of my research on participatory frameworks for some time. The International Association for Public Participation was established in 1990, and it has grown in membership size, serving more than 16,000 due-paying members globally. The IAP2 spectrum communicates different levels of engagement that are meant to assist planners and public participation professionals with aligning different community engagement goals with the intended scope for community influence. Our research helps illustrate or illuminate how the use of these standards may bestow authority on public engagement processes and also create the conditions for participation to be managed in other ways. For instance, through the rise of a participatory planning industry, which is at risk of narrowly serving the elite actor networks in an urban infrastructure governance environment that continues to be conditioned by post-politics and privatization. Moreover, my research with Janice Berry, Morgan Boyko, and Matt Nowoczewski is also demonstrating that on one hand, the deployment of participatory frameworks like the IAP2 spectrum may be creating a level of standardization, guiding public participation in planning processes, which helps to support inclusive and deliberative public engagement, a virtue. On the other hand, setting industry standards can also impose limits on those practitioners and communities seeking more diverse, creative, and place-specific approaches to participation. While standards like the IAP2 offer potential to support a shared language, a virtue, they also possess the power to potentially narrow what gets counted as participation to only those spaces curated through that framework. In other words, while the shared language may be raising the floor by setting clear expectations around different kinds of engagement practices, the managerial elements of participation may also be lowering the ceiling around what gets to count as participation and by whom. And there are more risks afoot. The rise of the participatory planning industry can fragment participation from planning. Rather than planners learning about participation in planning schools like this one, and then using those learnings in the future urban planning practice, participatory planning is also conducted by those practitioners who are trained in marketing and communications. It can no longer be assumed that those who are designing and facilitating participatory spaces have knowledge of urban planning. Who is doing participatory planning and who and what are being served by participation in planning are two questions requiring ongoing research, critical interrogation, and practice-based reflection as we continue to advance our understanding of the changing political economy of participatory planning and infrastructure. The IAP2 provides one useful conceptual framework to guide participation, a virtue. However, it is prudent to heed calls by philosophers like Nora Bernstein, who set out how conceptual resources made available to us in practice can unintentionally precipitate forms of gaslighting. In other words, we might remain attuned to the ways conceptual tools like participating frameworks can be misapplied. It is through structural gaslighting that the sabotaging, and I'm quoting, of conceptual resources that might otherwise help to accurately theorize the nature of oppression and promote resistance can also become, paradoxically, the site of willful ignorance, and can be used to destroy independent deliberative perspectives upon which disagreement can arise. Conceptual tools like participation frameworks and the practices they inspire can help to obscure the existing power structures and the processes that support them. Structural gaslighting occurs when power relationships are being obscured and when boundaries are being maintained in ways that reduce the capacities for different publics to wage challenges over time. For infrastructure planning, structural gaslighting is a particular problem because the power differences between infrastructure proponents and communities are stark, and the stakes between those two different groups cannot be any higher. So what do? While legislating deliberative forms of engagement and increasing opportunities for people to engage through formal processes of participation, on one hand is a welcome step towards recognizing the role communities play. We need spaces to critique who has power and how power is made, unmade, and remade within participatory planning spaces and processes. This critical work is important as we observe a changing political economy of participatory planning during a time when the embedding of public engagement practices within infrastructure planning seem to be perpetuating a focus on the de-risking of infrastructure delivery. Following the events that led to the cancellation of the East-West Link project in Melbourne, community engagement became a key strategy in the wider efforts to de-risk infrastructure planning. To achieve the latter, how participation is practiced needed to be managed. The changes we are witnessing have the potential to strengthen rather than challenge the positive feedback loop between participation and infrastructure planning, which also sets the stage for structural gaslighting to take root. Drawing structural gaslighting to the foreground in urban studies scholarship will allow researchers and practitioners alike to understand that there's a politics of participatory planning, and that politics has a structure. And it is from here where the profession needs to begin to ask itself, as well as academics and teachers like us, where do we find hope? In helping me to answer that question, I turn to the work of Gail Polhouse, a feminist philosopher who published a paper in 2020 called Gaslighting and Echoing, and Why Collective Epistemic Resistance is Not a Witch Hunt. Here they discuss the various strategies to reject the gaslighter on the terms as set by the gaslit. In essence, to disengage with the gaslighter and to reject their way of knowing the world. It is to step away from and actively look towards possibilities for other ways of knowing. In Polhouse's words, refusing to engage and calling upon others not to engage in particular ways of thinking need not shut down. Instead, it can be a call towards a different conversation. It need not be a disengagement from thinking altogether, but a disengagement from one particular line of thinking and an invitation to engage epistemically in another. For this reason, what appears to be disengagement from one perspective might also be characterized as animating new or different forms of engagement from another perspective. Insofar as this is the case, resisting disengagements can call upon others to participate in more justly structured environments, end quote. What Polhouse may be asking us to consider is how our work as scholars, educators, practitioners, and community advocates can expose the politics of participation within an ever-changing regulatory landscape of infrastructure delivery. This work includes understanding the emerging political economy of participatory planning, and in that work, joining communities to help actively seed alternative conditions that can open the spaces for different epistemic terms to emerge. Importantly, these are the terms being set by those communities with the most at stake. The work of seeding change needs to begin in our planning schools. How we teach participatory planning, if you are in how we teach participatory planning. And if you are like me and you teach a subject on participatory planning in an urban planning school like this one, perhaps part of the work of casting attention onto the structure of participation's politics is to move beyond the tools, the instruments, and the activities of participation that take us away from thinking about the political context in which this practice occurs. Instead, we might move towards a more embodied experience of participation that makes real the stakes, the different stakes communities face as vital in supporting an empowered and authentic dialogue that is locally situated and listens to the concerns of communities from the places where they speak. I'm almost done. I saw you look at your phone. Taking this line of argumentation one step further, work needs to be directed at refusing infrastructure planning status quo and to the building understanding of the conditions supporting the post-politics of infrastructure governance. One such condition are the existing environmental assessment processes that restrict community dialogue about projects and set boundaries about the ways those dialogues occur, allowing elite actors to continue to gain privileged positions within urban planning systems. In other words, planning scholars and practitioners seeking different conditions for their work may start to name and then begin to refuse the influence infrastructure proponents have over regulatory environments, narratives, and ways of knowing that allows them to protect their power. To do this work requires courage and the building of community, scholarly, and professional capacities to call out structural gaslighting as we see it in our collective practice. It demands that we be alert to the ways participatory planning conceals the positive feedback loop of structural gaslighting, in which communities, and I will add workers, are drawn into codependent relationships with the state and infrastructure authorities in ways that can be very troubling. What motivates me in this work is naming the conditions of structural gaslighting and making them visible. In doing so, I'm joining many other scholars across critical urban studies, as well as many practitioners and communities, I want to acknowledge their work, in their efforts to locate radical participatory spaces, processes, and epistemologies that invite new transformative and prefigurative possibilities that empowers diverse communities rather than diminishes them. This is more than just finding new ways of doing participation within infrastructure planning. It's about changing the very essence of participatory planning, including what work it is doing and who is establishing its grounding. At its core, it is about moving away from the instrumental, the commodified, and the commercial, and moving towards an embodied social, cultural, and political practice of participatory planning and urban infrastructure governance that is grounded in the relationships that are nested in place and connected through time. And that's it.
Cool. Many thanks, Christopher, for very fascinating presentation. I think we all agree that participation is very critical for planning for urban development, but it has never actually been implemented in a way that is expected. So we have a lot of time for questioning, so I will probably start. Crystal, what do you make of those who argue that participation is inefficient, costly, and that even when it is well done, the voices of those who are actually to be represented are not heard, which is forces behind the scene that actually work. So there's no need to invest in participation.
Yeah, so I teach participation in this faculty, and I teach it as both formal and informal, right? So when we talk about participation out there in the world in practice, we're thinking government sanctioned, proponent-led, there's a budget line kind of participation. And how I'm trying to frame it in my teaching and in my work is around informal participation. That participation is always around us, right? And part of our work as practitioners is to be present in the places upon which we work and labor and recreate and live, to be attuned to the desires and needs and the questions and conversations that are being had, right? So it's no longer just a budget item. So part of what I've seen over the last 10 years in Victoria is a rise in citizens' juries and these liaison panels, and there's a lot of money going into participation. It's a lot of money. Kind of big business, right? There's an industry that's rising. And my concern is that the meaningful engagement that is promising is skewed by the nature of the corporate context upon which it's happening. So, if a lot of our students go out and they graduate from here and they work in the private sector and they go and work for some of the really fantastic community engagement and consulting firms that are doing really good work, but there's a conflict of interest, right? They're hired by governments with political mandates, or they're hired by infrastructure proponents, so as clients. And so how do they mediate between those competing interests are really interesting questions for me. I don't know if I've just answered your question, but in terms of marginalized voices, again, it's the reconceiving participation so that it engages more with the informal.
Another question, can you end the slideshow?
Oh, sure, yes.
Can see you.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, sorry about that. And I'll put my camera on so people can really see me.
Okay. And those online, you're also welcome to Marcus, please.
Oh, Marcus, hello. I haven't seen you in a long time. Good to see you.
You are muted, please.
No, I'm unmuted. I've been on the other end of the participation process since I retired 17 years ago. And there are 2 points that I think complement what you're saying, but also expand them. One is access to data has become virtually impossible. The auditing of the Northeast Link was done by Saeed on the published documents only. I couldn't even find out what the parameter variations were. That's one area, which is the quarantining process of the basis for the consultation. Second area is a little more subtle. There's been a great deal of consultation on the Northeast Link, for example. But when you define a special purpose organization whose purpose is to do the Northeast Link, any consultation on the process of whether it should be there or not is, oddly enough, precluded. And strategy is one that I hope that you will include in your future analyses.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Marcus, thank you. Great questions. The concept that comes to mind when I think about the Northeast Link is social license. So community engagement occurs in lots of different forms, and we are seeing the rhetoric around communications that talks about buy-in, bringing communities along, managing expectations, right? It's a very managerial sort of logic. And a lot of that is about de-risking infrastructure delivery. And community engagement is about building a social license to operate, to deliver. And you might win a few concessions along the way. If you are representing your community on a community liaison panel, you might win some concessions, but the conversation is never about whether or not this is an appropriate project. So the bigger context, so this is one of 3 papers, and it's a series of components to it that help to get us to this idea of gaslighting, is that we tend to do community engagement quite well when we're talking about what's our vision, what's our hope for a city or a region. And then we go into project delivery, and then we start talking about how do we mitigate and manage impacts on communities. But there's a big gap around how do we prioritize, or how do we understand prioritization of projects. And that doesn't seem to be happening. With Infrastructure Victoria, that looks like an opportunity where that might start to happen. But as we've seen, they're an advisory body doing, I think, pretty good work. And then governments that will make their own decisions outside of what's being advised by their own statutory authority. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Krista. Anyone from the room before we go back to online? Any questions, comments from anyone?
Hello.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I have a
Yes,
question.
you go ahead.
Yeah. I'm a PhD candidate now, and my research is about the NGO and government relationship in China, because my focus is on the development of mega urban parks in China, because the local NGOs, they will have their interests, because they think the development of the urban parks, they will have a huge impact on the environment. For example, for the birds or other species. So they will have their interest in the development. But in China, the planning process, not like the Australian context. For example, in Australia, there will be money or budget allocated to the participation process. But in China, they participate in the informal way, because the government will not organize a meeting, for example, let different stakeholders participate. So they will participate in an informal way. But I noticed some interesting, because some NGOs, after they voicing their demands, for example, they will say, the development will have a huge impact on the environment, on the bird species. But in the later stages, they will endorse or they will encourage, they will show agreement on the government's low performance administrative style. For example, I noticed, some NGOs, they challenge the government, and other NGOs, they will say, oh, you are doing the wrong thing. You shouldn't challenge this. So they will keep a distance from this kind of NGOs. So I would like to know whether this kind of behavior is another or the deeper form of gaslighting. Because I don't know the reason they will do these kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think I can't answer that question directly, but I do think it's important that we're clear about what gaslighting is. And I'd love to bring in the debate around structural gaslighting, because it is a debate, right? I can see there's pushback. So gaslighting is an interpersonal experience, right? People gaslit other people. And when you get gaslit, you don't always know you're being gaslit, right? And that's one of the most insidious things to come to understand, is that you can be complicit in your own gaslighting and not know it at an interpersonal level. The impact of gaslighting is that it impacts on one's capacity to know what's so, right? So the deliberative capacities, I discussed deliberative capacity. So your capacity to know the experience that's occurring for you, being able to articulate it in your own words, on your own terms, gets manipulated through the kind of dependency of someone else's framework. Now, extending that out to structural gaslighting or institutional gaslighting or political gaslighting is seen by some as problematic, because institutions, the debate is that, do institutions gaslight? Or do structures gaslight, or do they create the conditions for gaslighting behaviors? So where I've landed is that structures create the conditions for gaslighting behavior. So the third paper, we just submitted it last night, is looking at whether or not those of us who work as laborers in the system that is oppressive and has constraints and sets parameters on our way of working, whether workers in the planning system are being gaslit. So there's like layers of it. So what I presented today was about communities, but the extension of that is whether or not those who are out there doing community engagement really believe in the practice, it's a virtue, are being gaslit within a system that is setting them up to fail on the basis of maybe conflict of interest with, who's paying, whose contract has been signed to deliver the work, and that's something that I'm still sitting with. So I'm not entirely sure, but I am working on finding more case studies of structural gaslighting and to engage with others who are thinking about gaslighting to see whether or not there's a case to be made for it, or whether or not there's just limits and we just acknowledge those limits. And I'm prepared to accept that too. Yeah.
Thank you, Crystal.
So the case that comes to mind when you were talking about all of this is the Yanyin Road Stage 1 and 2 upgrades, which are close to me, which I've been involved in. So there was a big community campaign to save 3 ancient red guns, and then the response, ultimately there was an environmental impact statement, but the response of the government was to then effectively destroy 6 other trees. But they weren't the ones they were never under threat before, but they are now because the road's been rerouted. And it feels like that's just, it's probably partly incompetence, I think, because the design is quite poor, the outcome is quite poor, and it could have been done in a much sounder design. But also, it's like because that specifically wasn't raised as a risk by the community, then it's then effectively missed out on being involved in the process. And there were community boards which took part in the design process really outside of that system, which was kind of raised through petitions or whatever. And I know that the experience of people who were involved in those was extremely bad. It just felt like their time's not valued. It's free contribution, and then they took part in a process where they ultimately weren't really listened to.
Yeah, the cost of participation is huge, right? And one of the ways in which big infrastructure can create the conditions for gaslighting is by overwhelming us with information. So if anyone who's been involved in an environmental effects statement process or a panel hearing, there are binders of technical documentation that one needs to get their head around. And typically you will outsource an expert to come in and review the material and be your advocate, right? And you do that because that's the only way you'll have your voice heard, because those are the terms of engagement as set by the planning system currently. So when I go out and offer advice to communities, rightly or wrongly, is I encourage them to play 2 games, right? There's the engage with the formal, but recognize that because particularly with transport infrastructure, which has a big geography and massive spatiality, very quickly you can get communities pitted up against each other, right? And that's another kind of concern around community engagement, especially if it can be very place specific, and that's good because I like place-based planning. That's a virtue. But then if those communities aren't working together in some way, the potential for power making gets eroded. And the difference between the East-West link, that's why I started it with the East-West link, and then the Westgate Tunnel, which is the other project that I know most about, the strategies to engage communities were so fundamentally different. In part, I think, of course, this is my hypothesis, is because the government knew what was at stake, right? It was a different government. It was a Labour Party government, and that had different things about it that change the political landscape to stop a project like the Westgate Tunnel. But it was really hard for those communities to gain traction in a project that was just as egregious, if not more, to the East-West link. So I find the spatiality of some of this, the politics of participation, also really interesting.
Yeah, I think with the Westgate Tunnel, things like the disposal of land, clean fill or contaminated fill, that also related to the privilege of the communities which were involved in receiving the things, and I think that is a real problem.
Yeah.
So some communities just don't have that power.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, for sure.
Thanks.
There might be a question in chat box.
Does anyone want to ask questions from online? Okay, Marcus. You are muted.
There's a lot of really long questions in the chat. I don't know if
it's a simple one. It is, what's the measure of success or otherwise? Because I think that community trust in government and government processes has been declining.
Yeah.
And one of the areas in which I would hope it would be improving is in areas of consultation and engagement. And so I was surprised to hear the omission of that dimension in your discussion. So I wondered if you'd like to add a few words.
Yeah, well, I think if I hear correctly from the practice-based community in terms markers of success, it's to be clear with communities about the expectations of influence. Communities, on the other hand, will have a different set of benchmarks for success, of course, one of which will no doubt be influence. If I were to wave a magic wand, one of the things that I'd like the government to do to change would just be around things like transparency, you know, really fundamental stuff like using Infrastructure Victoria, its advice in ways that create a pipeline, or at least a narrative around why the projects we're seeing prioritized are being prioritized, you know? So there's so much about the governance of infrastructure planning, at least in this state, that is quite problematic at the moment. And a lot of it is all over the media. Like, I mean, you just read about what's happening with Northeast Link or Westgate Tunnel as of late, and or Suburban Rail Loop, another example, and you can kind of get across it.
Thank you so much, Krista. I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone have a question here? If not, then we'll read some of the questions that, sorry, I don't have my one.
Yeah, please.
You asked this, is participation always good for communities? It seems like you're saying that maybe when it's gaslit free, because or when the spaces are invited space, they're agnostic enough, maybe that's good. I was just wondering, are there any spaces like that? I mean, do we have any examples?
This is what got me. So this is what started me on this journey about 10 years ago, was trying to find good practice in participation. And I got a critical mind, so it's hard for me to see it because there's always something, right? And the thing about gaslighting, right, is well-intentioned people can gaslight, right? I mean, we can all gaslight, but it's about understanding it as a mechanism of power. And so when I teach participation and when I write about it, my whole shtick is to understand the structure of the politics of participation and who's setting the parameters of who's winning and who's losing, and how do we know that, and who's deciding that, right? And I think in the literature on participation, that's not that conversation hasn't been as robust and rigorous for some time. So I guess my interest in thinking about the political economy, which of course is looking at the commercialization of participation, is to ask the question, can we do good participation in the context upon which it's being practiced, which is highly privatized at the moment? I don't know. It's a question. Good question for a PhD. Marek.
You just said that we all might gaslight us, not gaslight ourselves, we might gaslight other people.
Well, I think it's a mechanism.
And we might gaslight with we might gaslight others without ourselves knowing that we're gaslighting them. Is that?
I think so. I think it's, like, I mean, it's a fascinating body of literature.
And is that because there's a lack of transparency between communication? So we might be communicating some kind of idea.
Yeah.
And it's those who are that idea that's been communicated.
Yeah.
That's where it hasn't been transparent. But
yeah. So like a really common example of gaslighting is when someone says, "Hey, Marek, I had this thing happen." And you're like, "Ah, I wouldn't worry about it." Right? Like that's kind of the common form of gaslighting at an interpersonal level. Yeah. I think extending it out to structures where I make the argument that we are all capable of gaslighting is because we're all within structures that create the conditions for that to happen. And so to be attuned to that is to just open your eyes to it. And once I started reading about gaslighting many years ago, I just got really into the literature over some years. And then I was in conversation with one of my colleagues, Dallas Rogers and Chris Gibson, about some of the big infrastructure projects. And I'm just like, oh, they're gaslighting us. They're gaslighting communities. And they're like, whoa, let's explore that further and see what we can do with it. So that was the journey.
just Ash, I just wanted to say gaslighting from above. That's the other thing. I feel like a lot of the time we're talking about gaslighting coming from bottom top down.
Yeah.
But can it go the other way as well?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
From a community to.
Oh, no, I mean.
To end on a note of hope.
Well, I think it can happen in lots of different ways. So I don't have any case studies on the top of my head, but I'm open to the possibility that can happen too, but I don't know, Sarah. I don't know.
Because I thought the power was what actually forms the problem.
Yeah, depends on, people who are in practice might have positional power, but they might not have like anyways, there's different conceptions. Another conversation. I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. It's a good question. Yeah.
Quickly. Just a quick comment, because we talked about the interpersonal kind of relationship. So I was just thinking about as parents, for example, we try to create some realities for our children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is that a form of like positive kind of gaslighting?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to be the expert of calling out, what's what. I just. Kate Abramson's book on gaslighting, which just came out, is fabulous. It's such a good read. I have a copy of it, happy to share it around. But it's interesting reading it. You're like, oh, yes, okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.